Inside the Pediatric Psychiatric Unit, Dr. Eliza Tenilius opened case number 3. It concerned a young patient named Dean and a series of claims that defied standard clinical categorization. Dean insisted his house was haunted. This wasn't a vague fear of the dark. He claimed to have physical contact with a full-body apparition that appeared during his waking hours. The child provided a consistent, chilling description of the entity. She was a young girl in a white gown, with long red hair on one side of her head, while the other side of her face was a map of severe, raw burn scars. Dean reported that she would simply sit on the edge of his antique bed and swing her legs. His reaction was the most unusual part of the file. He didn't feel a sense of dread, but rather a comforting familiarity, as if he knew the girl personally. The investigation took a turn when Dr. Tenilius interviewed Dean's father, Mark. It was revealed that Mark had been seeing this exact same burned girl, in the same white gown, sitting on the end of that same bed for years. When 2 generations report identical details of a specific grotesque trauma victim, the case moves beyond individual nightmare. Dr. Tenilius realized that to find the source of the girl on the bed, she had to look at the father's childhood. In the 1970s, Dean's father, Mark, was a 12-year-old boy. He spent every moment of his free time with his best friend, Stephen. At that time, children were often left to the streets, locked out of their homes until the streetlights came on. This cultural routine gave Mark and Stephen hours of daily, unsupervised freedom to explore the bushlands and abandoned properties of their town. As dedicated Boy Scouts, the boys had been trained in survival skills and fire starting, giving them a dangerous level of confidence when handling flammable materials. One afternoon, they hiked far beyond their usual trails and found an abandoned cricket ground. It was a site of total decay, featuring a half-rotten fence and a boarded-up canteen, completely hidden from adult eyes. They spotted a small maintenance shed secured with a heavy padlock. Mark and Stephen used a rock to smash the lock open, finally forcing their way into the dark, foul-smelling interior. This combination of isolation, childhood competitiveness, and scout training created a situation where the boys felt they could control elements far beyond their understanding. Inside the shed, they found a massive length of boundary rope and several oily, sealed barrels. The air was thick with the stench of damp rot and stagnant chemicals. They opened a barrel of blue kerosene and submerged the entire length of the boundary rope until it was fully saturated with the fuel. Mark and Stephen dragged the dripping rope out to a patch of long grass. They coiled it around to form a massive closed loop, stacking the kerosene-soaked rope on top of itself. The boys both stepped into the center of the ring. Their plan was to spark the fuel, then jump through the wall of fire before it became too intense. But the kerosene didn't just burn. It erupted. A blinding wall of heat and smoke instantly cut off their escape routes. Mark made a desperate, blind dive through the perimeter, rolling into the grass. Scorched and gasping, he managed to clear the circle of fire. Stephen followed moments later, but he didn't clear the flames. He collapsed into Mark's arms with catastrophic burns. He whispered a final joke about his hair, blinked twice, and passed away in the bushland. Mark was left alone with the body of his best friend. He would carry the weight of that afternoon for the rest of his life, a secret trauma that manifested later as a crushing dependency on alcohol and a paranoid fear of fire.
Decades later, Mark's survival had turned into a permanent state of survivor's guilt. He was a man defined by what he had lost in that grass circle. Mark's primary way of interacting with his son, Dean, was through the lens of this trauma. He would often drink heavily and deliver intense, frightening warnings to the boy, obsessed with the idea that fire would eventually claim his son too. The household tension reached a breaking point when Mark bought a bargain antique bed for Dean's room, a physical object that seemed to anchor the family's shared anxiety. Dr. Tenilius suggested that Mark's constant, alcohol-fueled narration of his trauma essentially programmed the haunting. By constantly projecting his internal images of a burned child onto Dean, Mark created a shared psychological reality where the ghost became visible to them both. The entity Dean saw wasn't a random spirit. Her horrific burn scars were a perfect match for the trauma Mark had been describing and reliving for his entire adult life. This is why the girl on the bed didn't act like a monster. She was a reflection of the family's grief, a sad, quiet reminder of a childhood friend who never got to grow up. The kerosene circle proves that the most persistent hauntings aren't supernatural. They are the shadows cast by our parents' unspoken grief, finding a way to live on in the minds of the next generation.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So, today we are looking at something that is just, well, it's pretty unsettling.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really intense one.
Yeah. We're looking into the files of Dr. Eliza Tenelius. She's a specialist in a pediatric psych ward.
Right, which is usually a place of, rigorous science.
Exactly. Sterilized data, clinical precision. But her official files contain this one case study that just completely defies all of that.
It really does.
It's titled Shadows of the Pediatric Psych Ward. And it documents a phenomenon that she officially classifies as opening paranormal doorways.
Which immediately creates this fascinating friction, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean,
Yeah.
how does a doctor even justify that?
Well, you have a highly trained psychiatric professional cataloging raw supernatural data, but doing it alongside standard psychological evaluations.
Right.
She isn't just writing a ghost story here. She is documenting a clinical breakdown of how intense, unresolved grief might, literally act as a mechanism to tear open these doorways.
Okay, let's unpack this. The mission of this deep dive is to step right through that doorway with you.
Mhm.
We're going to explore how a really tragic, fatal childhood accident back in the 1970s ripped open a portal that stayed active across two entirely different generations.
Yeah, spanning decades.
Exactly. We are looking at a young patient in Dr. Tenelius's files named Dean. And Dean is in therapy because of a generational haunting.
Right.
And this haunting is directly tied to a horrific event experienced by his father, Mark.
What's fascinating here is that it requires us to look at how the environment we create in our own minds,
Yeah, the mental space.
Exactly. Specifically, an environment of just profound guilt, how that can eventually manifest in our physical reality.
Wow.
And subsequently, the reality of our children.
Right. I want you to think of generational trauma almost like a massive, heavy piece of inherited antique furniture.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like you never asked for it, it doesn't fit your life, but it gets moved into your house anyway.
Yeah, someone just drops it in your living room.
Right. It takes up space in your room, casting a shadow over everything else, and you're just forced to navigate around it every single day.
That is the exact framework Dr. Tenelius uses to approach Dean's situation.
Okay.
But to understand the shadow, we have to understand the object casting it. We have to reconstruct the specific timeline of Mark's trauma.
Right. We have to go back.
Exactly. Rewinding back to the 1970s, to a day that fundamentally and permanently rewired his brain.
So, Mark was 12 years old at the time,
Mhm.
and he and his best friend, Steven, were living out this specific kind of feral childhood.
Very typical of the era. Yeah.
Right. The source material describes an era of almost total unchaperoned freedom. I mean, kids were essentially locked out of their houses for the entire day.
Yeah, it's told to go play outside.
Exactly. The only rule was to beat the streetlights. If the streetlights came on and you weren't home, you were getting a whopping.
And the clinical notes actually focus heavily on this environmental context.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because children were operating in a world utterly devoid of adult mediation or structured play.
Just left to their own devices.
Exactly. And when you remove adult supervision, you essentially remove the conceptual framework for mortality. The world just becomes a massive, boundaryless playground.
I mean, we often romanticize that, right?
All the time.
We call them the free-range kids of the 70s. But looking at the sheer lack of supervision, I just have to ask, how is that not just a recipe for disaster?
Well, it kind of was.
Right. You have kids going on these massive walkabouts, pushing deep into unknown bushlands. That doesn't sound like innocent fun to me.
No, not at all.
It sounds like a ticking time bomb of liability.
Well, from a developmental psychology standpoint, it was exactly that.
Yeah.
In an environment with zero external stimulation provided by adults, boredom becomes this agonizing condition for the adolescent brain.
Wow. Agonizing.
Yeah. They weren't acting out of malice. They were driven by a desperate biological need for a dopamine hit to break the monotony.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that desperation for a thrill severely compromises their ability to assess physical danger.
Which perfectly explains why Mark and Steven strayed so far off the known dirt trails that afternoon.
Exactly.
They pushed past a creek, hiked over some grassy hills, and they just stumbled straight into a forgotten, decaying world.
Yeah, way out in the middle of nowhere.
Right. They found an old, completely overgrown, abandoned cricket ground miles away from anyone.
The isolation is the critical variable here.
Mm-hmm.
They are entirely cut off from any adult intervention, rescue, or even basic observation. They are completely alone in this decaying environment.
And the sensory details of their arrival are meticulously documented in the file.
The descriptions are so vivid.
They really are. You have this half-rotten picket fence surrounding the grounds.
Yeah.
There's a boarded-up canteen in total disarray with actual holes weathered right into the roof.
Just completely falling apart.
Right. Moss-covered vines and trees are physically growing through the structure, reaching up toward the sunlight. It's literally nature reclaiming human infrastructure.
And their immediate instinct isn't caution.
No, of course not.
It's conquest.
Exactly. They try to find a way into the canteen by climbing the trees and dropping onto the roof.
Because why wouldn't they?
Right, but they can't fit through the holes. But from that vantage point, up in the trees, they spot their next target.
And the maintenance shed.
Yes, a frail, decrepit, 12-square-meter maintenance shed. It is exactly the kind of dangerous, off-limits structure two 12-year-old boys are just drawn to. Mark shouts, "It's on!" And Steven yells back, "Time to race, Mother F!"
Yeah. And they just launch themselves out of the trees.
It's a pure, visceral escalation of play. They are rolling into the long grass, pushing and shoving each other in this boisterous rush to just be the first one to reach the shed.
And Steven wins the race.
Okay.
He taps the wall of the shed first.
Right.
And there's this highly specific detail in the file that just grounds the story in such a vulnerable reality.
The inhaler. Yeah. Steven is so out of breath from the sprint that he has to pull out his asthma inhaler and take 2 puffs before he can even celebrate his victory.
Wow.
It reminds you how incredibly fragile they actually are. But then they hit an obstacle. A massive, heavy, old padlock on the shed door.
See, a lock implies a boundary.
Right.
It implies something is being kept safe or something dangerous is being kept away.
Yeah, a warning.
But for a dopamine-seeking 12-year-old, a lock is just a challenge.
So they grab a rock and smash the padlock off.
Typical.
The door is stuck in years of built-up dirt, so they have to pry it open together.
Okay.
First, a creak, then a bang, finally a massive boom as the door breaks open.
Just tearing it open.
Spider's webs snap, dead leaves rain down from the ceiling, and the boys are hit in the face with this foul breeze.
The file calls it the stench of damp death.
Yes! They almost drop to their knees, holding their noses. I mean, it's like they cracked open the seal of an ancient tomb that was just holding its breath.
That's a great analogy. Notice the psychological shift there, too.
What do you mean?
The shed, physically shuddering, the overwhelming stench of decay, it's the tangible manifestation of crossing a forbidden boundary.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They haven't just opened a door, they've breached a space that had been deliberately sealed off from their world.
And the contents of that space quickly turn a playful afternoon into a horrific trap.
Yeah, it goes bad so fast.
Mark and Steven step inside. It's full of dusty workbenches and discarded tools. But in the corner, they find a stack of heavy, long ropes used to line the length of the cricket pitch and a sealed barrel of blue fluid, kerosene.
This is where Dr. Tenelius's notes really start tracking the mechanics of a disaster locking into place.
They pry open the barrel, they drag one of these incredibly long cricket ropes over to it and feed it inside until it's completely soaked in the blue accelerant.
Heavy with it.
Right. Then they haul this heavy, dripping rope out into an open area of long grass. Steven gets tired of dragging it, so he just loops it around into a massive circle. The rope is just coiling and stacking on top of itself.
Yeah.
Now, they're Boy Scouts, so they know how to spark a fire using a piece of broken glass to catch the sun.
Which introduces the fatal elements.
Right.
They have the practical knowledge to initiate combustion, but they completely lack the cognitive maturity to respect it.
Exactly. So they invent a game. They plan to spark the rope with the glass and then try to beat the burning flame as it races around the circle or, jump through the wall of fire.
Which is incredibly reckless.
But to play this game, they make a decision that just paralyzes me every time I read it.
It's so hard to read.
They decide they need to stand inside the circle of kerosene-soaked rope before they light it.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? How do 2 capable kids intentionally trap themselves in the dead center of a massive ring of highly flammable accelerant?
It comes back to the concept of risk homeostasis in the adolescent brain.
Okay, explain that.
They don't view the kerosene as a lethal, uncontrollable chemical reaction.
Right.
They view it as a localized, temporary obstacle in a game. They are convinced they have the agility to win.
Wow.
Their brains prioritize peer validation and the immediate thrill over the abstract, distant concept of severe injury. If we connect this to the bigger picture, they operate under a profound illusion of invincibility.
But that invincibility just evaporated in a fraction of a second.
Instantaneously.
As soon as the glass focused the sun onto the rope, the entire coiled circle ignited. It wasn't a slow burn they could race.
Yeah, it just went up.
It erupted into an unbearable, intense wall of fire. The smoke instantly blinded them.
Yeah.
Survival instinct kicks in, shattering the game, and they separate. Mark dives through the flames, rolling out into the grass, just rubbing his eyes and screaming out for Steven.
The file details the emotional intensity of these final moments with agonizing clarity.
It's off.
The fire had trapped Steven. As the flames finally begin to die down, Steven manages to dive out over the burning embers.
But the fire had done catastrophic damage.
Yeah.
He lands directly in Mark's arms, severely burned. Mark is holding his best friend, looking into his eyes, and the realization hits him that Steven isn't going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
In his final moments, Steven looks up at Mark and whispers with this heartbreaking, morbid humor.
Yeah, the whisper.
Well, looks like Mom won't need to give me that haircut now.
Oh, man.
He breathes shallowly, blinks twice, and just passes away right there in the grass.
It is a devastating end to a childhood friendship.
Utterly devastating.
And it's the absolute destruction of Mark's psychological baseline.
You cannot overstate the staggering weight of being 12 years old and having your best friend die in your arms.
No, you really can't.
Especially because of a game you both constructed. How does a child's brain even begin to process that level of culpability?
It doesn't.
No.
No, it fractures. And the justice system certainly didn't help.
Right. I wanted to ask about that.
The file notes that Mark was one of the first children of his age to face actual criminal charges.
Manslaughter, right.
A manslaughter, death by misadventure, causing the death of a minor. He is thrust into a legal meat grinder that holds him accountable for murder at an age where he isn't even old enough to drive a car.
That's insane.
This tragedy fundamentally shaped his adult personality. It cemented a foundation of unresolved trauma and this intense, vibrating guilt.
And we see exactly how that trauma shaped his life decades later when he became a father.
Mm-hmm.
When Mark had his own son, Dean, his unresolved grief manifested in a highly volatile parenting style.
Yeah, very volatile.
Fueled by what the file calls liquid courage, Mark would frequently burst into Dean's room in the middle of the night.
It's just terrifying for a kid.
To deliver these terrifying drunken bedside warnings, it was an aggressive, fear-based directive to never, ever play with fire.
Mm-hmm.
Dean actually thought his father was playing a cruel game of fright and seek.
Which is a classic, albeit dysfunctional, trauma response.
Right.
Mark is trying to exert control over his son's environment to prevent a recurrence of his own greatest failure.
Yeah.
But in doing so, he is flooding his child's environment with ambient terror.
But Mark's trauma didn't just leak out in his parenting.
No, it goes much deeper.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where Dr. Tennelius's file shifts from a tragic psychological study into the realm of the paranormal.
The doorways.
Exactly. The intense, horrific energy of the kerosene fire seemingly permanently altered Mark's reality. He began experiencing a relentless cycle of hauntings. He was constantly tormented by a full-body apparition in his home.
And we have to look closely at the physical description of this apparition,
Why is that?
because it is highly specific and clinically significant in the file.
Okay, well, Mark saw a ghost girl. She wore a white gown, had half a head of long red hair, and a half-burnt face.
Right.
Mark had bought this antique frame bed for a bargain price, and this ghost girl would sit at the end of that bed.
Just sitting there.
As Mark walked past the doorway, he would look in, and she would be staring at him with a childlike smirk of joy.
Unbelievably creepy.
And it happened so continuously that Mark's coping mechanism was to just become entirely numb to it. He just started ignoring her.
He normalized the haunting the exact same way he tried to normalize his guilt.
But if we're looking at this analytically, there is a massive disconnect here.
Oh, definitely.
Steven, Mark's 12-year-old male best friend, was the one who burned to death.
Right.
So if this ghost is born of Mark's guilt, why is the entity a girl in a white gown?
Yeah.
My instinct is to say that if this is a hallucination, it's just a distorted funhouse mirror of the drama.
Actually, Dr. Tenilius looks at this disconnect very specifically in her notes.
What does she say?
She doesn't view it as a disjointed hallucination at all, but rather as the mechanics of how a paranormal doorway operates.
Okay.
The physical description of the apparition, the half-burnt face, is a direct, undeniable tether to the kerosene fire.
Right, the burns match.
But the identity of the ghost, being a red-headed girl, suggests something far more complex than just a simple memory replay.
So if it's not a replay of Stephen, what is it? Are we talking about a pre-existing entity?
This raises an important question, and it is the core hypothesis she explores. Did Mark's immense, radiating guilt act as a supernatural magnet?
A magnet.
Yes. Consider the antique bed he brought into the house. In clinical parapsychology, there's a theory that objects can harbor stagnant energy or attachments.
Right, haunted objects.
Exactly. Dr. Tenilius questions whether that bargain antique bed already had a dormant entity attached to it.
Oh, wow.
And Mark's overwhelmingly powerful emotional state, his trauma, acted as the catalyst that woke it up.
So his grief powered it.
Yes. The entity then shaped its appearance, specifically the burns, to reflect Mark's own deepest, most agonizing sin back at him.
It's the concept of a psychological funhouse mirror, but one that uses a literal spirit as the glass.
Exactly.
Mark ignoring the ghost was his way of surviving his own mind. But a haunting in a family home isn't an isolated event, you know?
No, it's a shared environment.
Right, you can't just contain that kind of dark, vibrating energy in a vacuum. Eventually, the burden of the kerosene circle, the guilt, the trauma, the literal ghost, it all passed down to the next generation.
It passed down to Dean.
And this is the culmination of the case file.
Mm-hmm.
This is the doorway fully opening for the sun.
Exactly.
Dean eventually realizes that his father's terrifying drunken warnings weren't just the ramblings of a broken man.
Yeah.
They were grounded in a terrifying reality. The file details the exact moment Dean sees the ghost girl for himself.
This part is chilling.
He is in his room, and he looks over at the antique bed, and she is sitting there calmly. Her legs are hanging over the edge, swaying back and forth in this playful, almost innocent motion. She looks at Dean, and she blinks.
The emotional texture of Dean's encounter is vastly different from his father's, though.
How so?
Dean notes that the entity looks at him with familiarity, with kindness, and with a profound sadness.
Sadness.
Yes. A sadness rooted in the inherent knowledge that she is no longer alive.
She fades away into mist, leaving Dean with permanent, chilling proof that the entity born of the fire and the guilt was definitively real.
Yeah.
Imagine the paralyzing terror of realizing your parents' darkest, most drunken fairy tale is actually sitting at the foot of your bed in broad daylight.
I can't even imagine.
If Mark's trauma was so severe, how did it go from an internal struggle to something his son actually interacted with?
Well, if we look at the psychological mechanism of shared psychotic disorder folia do, we see how a dominant individual can transfer their delusions to a secondary person in a closed environment.
Right.
But Dr. Tenilius goes further. By classifying this as an open doorway, she suggests that Dean didn't just inherit a bargain antique bed or even a shared delusion.
What did he inherit?
He inherited the crushing weight of his father's unresolved guilt made manifest.
Wow.
The ghost's sadness that Dean observes reflects the lingering, stagnant energy of a generational trauma that was never properly healed. Mark carried the kerosene circle with him for decades, and because he couldn't process it, it materialized in the exact environment where he was trying to raise his child.
It's an incredibly heavy journey.
It really is.
We've traced the path from a feral, unchaperoned 1970s walkabout to the split-second horror of a fatal kerosene fire, and finally to a chilling psychiatric case file where a father and son are forced to share the exact same burnt apparition. And the reason this matters, the reason we are unpacking this case file today is because it offers a stark, unavoidable look at how the secrets we bury and the unhealed wounds we refuse to treat can literally haunt the environments we build for our families.
Exactly.
It's the invisible inheritance we pass down without even realizing it.
And as we close this deep dive, I think there's a broader societal implication here that is worth mulling over.
Oh, definitely. What are your thoughts?
We look back at the 1970s as this era of ultimate freedom, where kids roamed abandoned structures until the streetlights came on.
Yeah, the good old days.
Right. Today, we live in an era of hypervigilance, where parents track their children's locations with GPS on their phones. We often view that shift as just a change in technology or culture.
Right.
But after looking at Mark's trauma, you have to wonder,
Wonder what?
Is modern helicopter parenting actually a massive collective trauma response?
Whoa.
Are today's extreme safety measures just our society reacting to the ghosts of the kids like Steven who didn't make it home when the streetlights came on?
That is a truly haunting thought.
Yeah,
Maybe we are all just trying to outrun the generational ghosts of the ultimate free-range childhood.
exactly.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.